The sound of laughter sliced across the parade ground like broken glass. Samuel Drake's back slammed against the sun-bleached wall of the barracks, his gardening tools clattering to the concrete in a scatter of steel and dirt. The marigolds he'd been tending just seconds earlier lay crushed beneath the boots of three towering trainees. Their uniforms were sharp, their bodies sculpted by months of punishing preparation. But their smirks, sharp, arrogant, cruel, were what drew the eyes of the gathering crowd. "You call that a tattoo?" Keller sneered, pressing his forearm hard into Samuel's chest. "Looks like a toddler's doodle. What's it supposed to be, Grandpa? A frog with a dinner fork?" The recruits erupted in laughter, each one louder than the last. Moreno, tall and lean with the swagger of someone who believed he'd already earned the world, snorted and mimed holding a trident. Davis added, "Nah, that's not a frog. That's a tadpole. Tadpole division, right? Supply clerks of the sea." The words stung the air, but Samuel did not react. His body gnarled, weathered, stubbornly upright at 82, absorbed the ridicule without flinching. His faded denim shirt hung loose on his thin frame. The sleeves rolled to reveal sinewy forearms, browned by decades of Sunday. But the center of their mockery, the tattoo etched into his left arm, was little more than a blurred emblem, its ink dissolved by time into a smudge of gray blue. Keller jabbed a finger against it. "Disgraceful. My little sister's henna looks tougher than this." Samuel's pale eyes, clouded by age but steady, rose at last to meet Keller's. There was no anger in them, no fear, only an unsettling calm. The stillness of a deep lake that had swallowed storms before. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, but it carried with the clarity of a church bell. "It's just a memory, son." The simple phrase silenced the nearest onlookers for half a heartbeat. But silence, to boys desperate to prove themselves, was fuel for escalation. "A memory?" Keller barked. "Of what signing cafeteria orders?" He stepped back, raising his voice so the spectators, trainees, sailors, even a few civilian workers could all hear. "This base is for warriors, not washed-up gardeners with bedtime stories." Laughter spread, cruel and echoing. The recruits puffed out their chests, playing to the crowd. Samuel slowly bent, collecting his trowel with hands still steady despite the veins of age. He brushed dirt from its handle, his movements deliberate, patient. He had seen worse than this, jungles filled with men whose weapons were not words but machetes. He knew the sound of real danger, and this was not it. But to the crowd, the scene was different. Three young men, brimming with muscle and arrogance, looming over a wiry old man who smelled faintly of soil and blossoms. It was humiliation painted in broad strokes, and it was becoming unbearable to watch. A junior petty officer stood at the fringe, shifting nervously, clearly unsure whether to intervene. His gaze flitted from the recruit's powerful shoulders to the fragile outline of the gardener and back again. He took one step forward, then faltered, fear shackling him in place. Keller seized the moment. He crouched low, his sneer curling into something uglier. "Tell me, old man," he whispered, his voice dripping venom. "Did you earn this mark, or did you buy it from a drunk with a needle in Tijuana?" The crowd hissed. Some shook their heads. Others, mostly fresh recruits, snickered nervously, as if unsure whether to join the cruelty or reject it. Samuel's expression did not change, but deep behind those pale eyes, something stirred. The sun overhead blurred, the laughter faded, and in an instant Samuel was elsewhere, not on Fort Resolute's parade ground, but in the suffocating humidity of a jungle half a century ago. The sharp sting of mosquitoes buzzed in his ears. The smell of mud thick with blood and gunpowder filled his nose. And across from him, in the glow of a single lantern beneath a rain-drenched poncho, his teammate Marcus Haynes dipped a needle into soot mixed with whiskey. The sting of ink cut into Samuel's skin. The emblem took shape, not for vanity, not for the world, but for the brotherhood. A symbol etched in mud, pain, and secrecy. The flash was gone. The sun was back. Keller's laughter roared again. Moreno tipped over Samuel's tool bag, scattering gloves, a battered thermos, and a packet of seeds across the ground. "What's in here, Grandpa? Prune juice?" he mocked, holding the thermos aloft like a trophy. Laughter erupted again, sharper, meaner. Samuel exhaled quietly. Not with fear, not with submission, but with profound disappointment. His fingers tightened briefly around the trowel. He knew exactly how much pressure it would take to break Keller's wrist in 3 places. But he didn't move. Not yet. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that something deeper, older, and infinitely more dangerous was stirring beneath the gardener's calm exterior. And 50 feet away, half hidden behind a row of palms, Command Master Chief Avery froze, his eyes locked on Samuel's arm, on that crude faded tattoo. Recognition slammed into him like a bullet. He knew that mark. He'd seen it once, sketched in the back pages of a classified report that most believed to be myth. A chill washed over him. God help us, Avery whispered. That's not just some gardener. The laughter swelled again, bouncing off the walls of Fort Resolute's barracks like a cruel chorus. Marino kicked at Samuel's spilled gloves, sending them skidding across the concrete. Davis bent, picked up the battered thermos, and unscrewed the lid with exaggerated flair. "What's inside, old man?" Davis jeered, sniffing theatrically. "Prune juice? Or maybe Ensure?" The recruits howled. Even a few in the crowd chuckled, though the sound was brittle, uneasy. Samuel, still on his knees, calmly retrieved the crushed marigold stem that had been trampled under Moreno's boot. With weathered fingers, he set it gently back into the soil, as though coaxing it to live again. His movements were slow, deliberate, ignoring the ridicule raining down. His silence grated on them more than any insult could have. Keller crouched again, his face inches from Samuel's. His teeth gleamed in the sun, his smirk wide and venomous. "Answer me, Grandpa, or are you too senile to remember what your little doodle even means?" The crowd shifted. A young sailor muttered, "Come on, leave him alone." His friend elbowed him sharply into silence. Nobody wanted to be the one to challenge SEAL candidates. Not here, not now. Samuel finally lifted his gaze. His eyes, pale, almost translucent, met Keller's without blinking. There was no heat in them, no flare of anger, only a depth that unsettled the younger man. "It's just a memory," Samuel said again, voice steady as granite. Keller's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, a hairline crack in his confidence. But arrogance is a fragile thing. It cannot bear being challenged, even by silence. He straightened, turned to the crowd, and raised his voice so all could hear. "You believe this guy?" Keller barked. "He's nobody. Probably hangs around here to soak up glory he never earned. A supply clerk, at best, stamping boxes while real men fought and died." Some of the spectators laughed nervously, clinging to the group's cruel energy, but others began to shift uncomfortably. They saw not a pathetic old man, but 3 towering trainees humiliating someone who had done nothing but tend flowers. The air grew heavier, the sun hotter. Moreno stepped forward, poking the faded tattoo with one thick finger. "This thing? It's embarrassing. You think that makes you one of us? This base is for warriors, not for janitors with bedtime stories." The jab lingered, Moreno's finger pressing harder against Samuel's arm. The ink blurred under the pressure, but Samuel did not flinch. Instead, his mind slipped again, unbidden, unstoppable. The crowd vanished. He was back in the Mekong Delta, 1968. The night was alive with insects, the air a suffocating blanket of humidity. He crouched beneath a makeshift tarp with Marcus Haynes and Eddie Ramirez, rain hammering the canvas overhead. Marcus held the needle steady, dipping it into blackened soot mixed with whiskey. "Hold still, Sam," he'd whispered, voice low to avoid patrols just yards away. The needle pricked skin over and over, carving a promise into flesh. Not for vanity, not for the world, but for each other. A secret crest, a brotherhood that would outlive them all. The sting had burned, but Samuel had embraced it. Pain was proof of belonging. And then, just as quickly, he was back. The roar of the crowd replaced the hiss of rain. The sun replaced the jungle canopy. Moreno's finger pressed harder, dragging him into the present. Keller seized Samuel's tool bag and yanked it open, rummaging through with theatrical disdain. He pulled out the trowel, a packet of seeds, and finally the thermos. Holding it high, he barked, "This is who you are. A gardener. A groundskeeper. Not a warrior." The recruits laughed. The crowd didn't. A heavy silence settled over the onlookers. Faces tightened. Whispers spread like wildfire. This wasn't training banter anymore, it was cruelty. Samuel remained perfectly still, his gaze distant, his breathing even. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, was beginning to feel like something else entirely. Something heavier. Something dangerous. And on the edge of the gathering, Command Master Chief Avery's pulse hammered. He knew that look. He knew that tattoo. And the realization clawed at his spine with cold fingers. If he was right, these boys weren't mocking a gardener. They were poking at a ghost who once carried nations on his back. The late afternoon sun blazed down on the parade ground, but the air had grown cold with unease. The laughter that once rolled so easily now sputtered in uneven bursts, forced and hollow. What had begun as entertainment for a few bored trainees had become something else, something uglier, more dangerous. Samuel remained kneeling by the marigolds, his old canvas bag at his side, half its contents scattered like offerings. His posture was unshaken, his breathing measured, each motion dusting dirt from his calloused hands. Gathering a stray packet of seeds was deliberate, patient, a stark contrast to the puffed-up, restless energy radiating from the three recruits circling him. Keller paced, jaw tight, eyes flicking from Samuel to the murmuring crowd. His performance was slipping. What he wanted, laughter, affirmation, dominance, was evaporating into a tension that pressed down like a storm cloud. "Say something," Keller demanded, voice sharp with frustration. "Defend yourself. You're not even supposed to be here, are you? Who let you onto this base?" Samuel raised his eyes again, calm and unblinking. "No one needs to let me in," he said softly. His words, quiet though they were, carried to the edges of the gathering. "This place already belongs to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Moreno barked a laugh, too loud, too forced. "Belongs to you? This is Naval Special Warfare Training Ground. You think a patch of dirt and some flowers gives you claim?" Samuel tilted his head, studying him, then looked down at the marigolds he had replanted. "Flowers grow anywhere," he said. "Respect doesn't." The word struck deeper than any insult. Some in the crowd shifted their weight uncomfortably, eyes darting between the old man and the recruits. A line had been crossed, and though no one dared step forward, a quiet shame began to ripple through the ranks of onlookers. Keller's face darkened. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You think you're teaching us something, old man? You think we'll learn respect from a has-been gardener with a cheap tattoo?" Samuel's expression never changed. The corners of his mouth didn't so much as twitch. His silence was no longer passive, it was commanding. Every second he refused to rise to their bait only made their jeers smaller, more childish. The pressure in the air mounted. Even the birds seemed to fall silent, the base itself holding its breath. On the edge of the crowd, Command Master Chief Avery felt his throat tighten. He knew arrogance when he saw it. Every class of trainees brought their share of brash young men who believed they'd conquered the world before earning the right to wear the uniform. But this was more than arrogance. This was desecration. And worse, Avery's gut told him that the man being mocked was no ordinary groundskeeper. He couldn't tear his eyes from the tattoo on Samuel's arm. Crude, faded, hand-inked. He'd seen it once before, buried in an old briefing binder, a collection of stories that were half rumor, half classified history. Ghost divers. A unit spoken of only in whispers. Their existence officially denied, their missions erased from records. That mark, that frog, clutching a trident, drawn in soot and blood. It couldn't be. Those men were legends, long gone. Yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt, silent, dignified. Avery's palms were slick. His heart thudded against his ribs. He wanted to stride forward, to pull the recruits off before they pushed further into sacrilege. But something stopped him. Instinct. A voice deep inside told him to wait, to watch, to confirm what his gut already knew. Keller shoved Samuel's shoulder, forcing him sideways. The crowd gasped. The shove wasn't hard, but the disrespect was absolute. Samuel steadied himself on one hand, rose slowly to his knees again, and simply exhaled. The sound was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a man who had endured far worse than the swagger of boys. Avery's jaw clenched, his decision crystallized. This wasn't a petty scuffle. This was a spark. And if he didn't move soon, the entire base was about to learn who exactly they were laughing at. And God help Keller and his friends when that truth landed. Keller's frustration boiled over. The old man's refusal to rise, his maddening calm, was a mirror Keller couldn't bear to face. He wanted a reaction. He wanted proof of dominance. With a swift kick, he sent Samuel's trowel skittering across the pavement. Then, crouching low, he snatched up the weathered canvas bag lying beside the marigolds. "Let's see what kind of warrior gear Grandpa carries," Keller announced loudly, shaking the bag so its contents rattled. The crowd edged in closer, the circle tightening, whispers swelling. Samuel's lips pressed together, but his eyes stayed on the flowers, not the thief. His hands rested lightly on his knees, still as stone. Keller rummaged through the bag theatrically, tossing aside a pair of gloves, a packet of seeds, and a rusted pruning shear. Each item clinked or fluttered against the pavement, landing like discarded relics. "Pathetic," Keller sneered, pulling out a dented thermos. He held it aloft for the crowd. "What do we have here? Grandpa's miracle elixir? Let's hope it's strong enough to keep his bones from crumbling." The recruits around him laughed. Davis reached for the thermos, unscrewed the lid, and sniffed with an exaggerated grimace. "Smells like prune juice to me. Figures." The laughter this time was thin, awkward. A current of disapproval hummed beneath it. Some of the sailors shifted uneasily, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. This wasn't tough guy banter anymore. It was cruelty, naked and mean. Keller wasn't finished. He dug deeper, pulling out a small packet wrapped in faded cloth. He tore it open without hesitation, scattering its contents tiny metal trinkets, a rusted lighter, a photograph yellowed with age. The photo fluttered to the ground face up. A younger Samuel stood shoulder to shoulder with two other men, all three in drenched fatigues, grinning beneath a jungle canopy. Their faces were smeared with camouflage, their eyes burning with something rawer than pride. Keller squinted at it, then held it up to the crowd. "Look at this jungle, Boy Scouts." The laughter this time didn't come. The silence was heavier than before, the crowd caught between disbelief and recognition. Something in the photo felt wrong to mock, sacred in a way most couldn't articulate. Moreno stepped forward, jabbing Samuel's tattoo with his thick finger again. "Tell us the story, old man, or is this just another bedtime tale you cooked up to feel important?" The pressure of Moreno's finger pressed the ink deeper into Samuel's flesh, and with it, the world tilted. The crowd vanished. Samuel was back in the stifling swamp heat, crouched beneath the roar of a helicopter that skimmed treetops. Rain lashed sideways, drowning out all but the rhythm of his heartbeat. In the muck beside him, Marcus Haynes pressed a needle into his skin, tracing the lines of the emblem that would bind them forever. A frog with a trident. Crude, imperfect, but sacred. The smell of whiskey mixed with blood filled his nose. Eddie Ramirez whispered through clenched teeth, "If we die out here, at least they'll know who we were." Lightning split the sky. The emblem burned into Samuel's arm, and then it was gone. The Sunday the recruits. The laughter, all crashing back in at once. Keller, now holding the photograph above his head, looked to the crowd for validation. Instead, he found eyes wide with unease, faces taut with a dawning recognition that something was terribly wrong. Samuel finally raised his head. His gaze swept the recruits, then the circle of spectators. His voice came soft but sharp enough to cut the air. "Be careful, boys," he said. "The rope you pull so hard to mock another, it might just be the one you hang yourself with." The words landed heavy. Keller's smirk faltered. Davis shifted uncomfortably. Moreno's finger withdrew from Samuel's arm, as though burned. And on the edge of the crowd, Command Master Chief Avery's pulse hammered faster. He had no more doubt. He needed to act. Because if this truly was Samuel Drake, then the storm about to break over Fort Resolute would be unlike anything these recruits had ever imagined. The roar of laughter bled away until all Samuel could hear was the pulse in his ears, steady and relentless. Moreno's touch on his tattoo had been the spark, and now the past surged forward in a flood that time could not hold back. The sun of Fort Resolute dimmed. The heat shifted. The voices of arrogant recruits dissolved into a chorus of cicadas and the whirring of helicopter blades overhead. Samuel was no longer kneeling on a parade ground. He was 21 again, half buried in the mud of the Mekong Delta, 1,968. Rain sheeted down, thick and punishing, soaking through every stitch of fatigues. 3 men huddled beneath a poncho stretched over bamboo poles, their rifles stacked within arm's reach. A lantern flickered, shadows cutting their faces into halves of light and darkness. Hold still, Sam, Marcus Haynes muttered, his Boston rasp rough with exhaustion. His hands, calloused and scarred, guided the needle with surgeon-like precision. This'll sting worse than a hornet. Samuel clenched his jaw as the crude needle pierced skin, over and over, tracing lines into his forearm. The ink soot scraped from rifle chambers, mixed with whiskey seared like fire. He did not flinch. The pain was a baptism, a rite. On his other side, Eddie Ghost Ramirez leaned close, his grin flashing in the dim glow. We ain't artists, brother, but when we're done, this'll mean more than any medal. This is ours, just us. The design emerged in jerks and scratches, a frog clutching a trident, ugly and raw, but alive. Not for ceremony, not for the brass. For them. For the nights when no one knew if dawn would come. For the unmarked graves they'd already walked past. Outside, thunder cracked, mingling with the far-off bark of AK fire. The jungle smelled of rot and gunpowder. The three men pressed close, and as Marcus finished the last line, he dipped the needle one final time and jabbed it into his own skin, carving the same symbol. Eddie followed, hissing as the soot burned into his flesh. They were not soldiers in that moment. They were not expendable names on a roster. They were brothers, swearing a vow etched in blood and soot, to go where no one else would and to bring each other home. The memory slammed shut as suddenly as it opened. The sun was back. The recruits loomed again, their sneers faltering under the weight of Samuel's silence. The photo still dangled in Keller's hand, but his grip was unsteady now, his arrogance cracking like cheap plaster. Samuel's fingers brushed the edge of his faded tattoo. The lines were blurred, nearly erased by decades of sun and sweat, but the fire behind them had not dimmed. His gaze lifted slowly, deliberately. He fixed Keller with a look so steady it rooted the younger man in place. Pale eyes met the recruit's dark ones, and for the first time, Keller felt the ground tilt beneath him. He didn't understand why his throat tightened, why his pulse spiked, why the hairs on his arms rose. But something in that look, a weight, a history, a power he could not name cut deeper than any words. The crowd sensed it too. The mocking murmurs died entirely. The air thickened with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. On the edge of the gathering, Command Master Chief Avery's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. The pieces in his mind clicked into place, one by one, with a precision that terrified him. The crude emblem. The unnatural calm. The name whispered once, long ago, in the margins of a file never meant to be opened. Samuel Drake. Ghost diver. A man who should not exist in the present, standing alive and breathing before him. Avery turned, his boots crunching against the gravel. His hand slipped to the phone on his belt. There was no time to hesitate. This was no longer about stopping three arrogant recruits. This was about alerting the highest levels of command before the unthinkable happened, before a living legend was further disgraced. And as his call connected, Avery's voice carried an urgency that shook even his own ears. This is Command Master Chief Avery. Get me Colonel Pierce, now. Avery's boots pounded across the gravel as he pressed the phone tighter to his ear. The line clicked, a young aide's clipped voice answering, Colonel Pierce's office. He's in session. This can't wait, Master Chief? It can't, Avery snapped, his tone like steel drawn from a scabbard. Put him on. There was hesitation, the muffled shuffle of papers. Then the aide tried again. Sir, the colonel is presenting to NATO liaisons. Unless this is a condition. One emergency. It is. Avery cut in. His voice dropped, low and absolute. Tell him it's about Samuel Drake. Silence. The kind of silence that only comes when a name detonates in the mind. The aide's breath caught audibly. Sir, are you sure? Avery's gaze flicked back toward the gathering. Keller had one hand fisted in Samuel's shirt now, hauling the old man half off his knees. The crowd rippled with outrage and uncertainty, frozen between action and disbelief. I'm looking right at him, Avery said. His words were a growl. And three recruits are about to cross a line they won't come back from. Get Pierce, now. Far across base, in a sterile conference room lined with flags and glowing projectors, Colonel Jonathan Pierce was halfway through a dry presentation on logistics. His voice droned over charts of numbers and supply lines, the kind of minutia that bored even him. The door burst open without a knock. His aide, normally unflappable, stood pale and wide-eyed. "Sir," he stammered, "Master Chief Avery on the line. He says it's a condition, one emergency." Pierce scowled. "A condition one? Unless the Russians are storming San Diego, I don't want interruptions." The aide swallowed, voice cracking. "Sir, it's about Samuel Drake." The room froze. The air seemed to vanish. At the far end of the table, a visiting admiral's glass clinked softly against the table as his fingers went slack. Another officer muttered a curse under his breath, his voice trembling. Pierce's chair scraped back violently as he shot to his feet. He snatched the phone from the aide's hand. "Avery, talk to me!" For 10 seconds, he listened. His face shifted from disbelief to shock to a cold, controlled fury that made the room's temperature plummet. "He's where?" Pierce demanded. "With who?" He didn't wait for an answer. His voice barked commands rapid fire. "Alert the motor pool. I want my vehicle running yesterday. Get my entire senior staff to the grinder in full dress uniform 5 minutes. Not 6. 5. Move!" He slammed the phone down, eyes blazing. The officers scrambled to their feet, chairs clattering against the wall. One dared to ask, "Sir, is it really him?" Pierce's reply was a whisper that cut sharper than a shout. "It is, and he's being mocked by children too ignorant to know they're prodding a goddamn legend." The conference room emptied in a storm of hurried footsteps, leaving only the glowing charts on the projector, suddenly meaningless in the shadow of a name thought lost to history. Back on the parade ground, Keller yanked harder on Samuel's shirt. "You're coming with us, old man. Base security can figure out which nursing home you wandered from." Samuel let himself be pulled upright, his joints creaking in protest. His expression never hardened, never broke. But for the first time, a flicker appeared in his eyes, something ancient and cold, a firebank too long. The crowd sensed it. A shiver rippled through the sailors and civilians watching. The recruits were too blind to see it, too consumed by their own arrogance. But Avery saw. And so did the handful of veterans scattered in the back of the crowd, their spines stiffening, their hands balling into fists. The storm was already on its way. They just didn't know it yet. The first sound was faint, almost dismissed as background noise, the distant wail of a siren carried on the wind. Some in the crowd turned their heads, brows furrowed. Sirens weren't unusual on a military base, but this one was different. Sharp, commanding, insistent. It grew louder, closer. More joined it. Not the familiar whoop of police cars, but the piercing shriek of military command vehicles. The air seemed to vibrate with authority. Keller's grip tightened on Samuel's shirt. His bravado wavered, but pride wouldn't let go. "They're coming for you, old man," he muttered, loud enough for the crowd. "Time to answer for trespassing where you don't belong." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. The crowd's gaze had shifted away from him, away from Samuel, toward the access road that bordered the grinder. Engines roared. Tires screeched. A convoy of black SUVs and command trucks thundered into view, lights flashing, sirens screaming. They braked hard, forming a semicircle around the gathering like a steel jaw snapping shut. Doors flew open in unison. Out poured officers and master chiefs in crisp service dress whites, their faces carved with fury and purpose. The golden eagles and anchors on their collars glittered in the sun, blinding in their precision. At their head strode Colonel Jonathan Pierce, his polished shoes striking the pavement with sharp, deliberate authority. His face was thunder itself, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped with each step. The crowd froze. The jeers died instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed the entire base held its breath. Even the wind stilled. Keller, Moreno, and Davis stood rigid, their arrogance draining away like water from a broken canteen. They snapped to attention instinctively, the survival reflex of men who suddenly realized they'd stepped into quicksand. Colonel Pierce did not look at them. He did not acknowledge the crowd. His eyes locked onto one figure and one figure only. Samuel Drake, still standing calmly amid the spilled tools and crushed flowers. The colonel halted 3 feet away, spine straight as an iron rod. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Pierce snapped to the sharpest salute of his decorated career, the motion cutting the air like a blade. "Mr. Drake," he boomed, his voice resonant, stripped of fury and filled only with reverence. "It is an honor to have you on my base, sir." The crowd gasped. The recruits' faces went white. The truth was descending, heavy as an avalanche, and there was no place left to hide. Colonel Pierce's salute hung in the air, rigid and precise, long enough for the silence to deepen into awe. The crowd stared, disbelieving. The man they thought was just a gardener, the frail old man mocked and shoved, was being honored by the base commander himself. When Pierce finally lowered his hand, his eyes burned as they swept toward the three recruits. His voice dropped into a lethal calm, carrying across the grinder like the crack of a rifle. "You three, do you see this man? Do you see that tattoo you found so amusing?" Keller swallowed hard. Moreno's Adam's apple bobbed. Davis's knees trembled. None dared to answer. Pierce's jaw tightened. He didn't wait. His voice rose, every syllable landing like a hammer strike. "This is Samuel Drake. Before there were SEALs, he was a ghost diver, one of the first. He bled in jungles whose names never made it onto maps. He volunteered for missions so classified they were buried in locked vaults, erased from every official record. And you arrogant children, thought him a joke." A ripple of shock tore through the crowd. Sailors stiffened. Civilian workers covered their mouths. Veterans in the back straightened like they'd been jolted with electricity. Pierce stepped closer, his fury now sharpened into raw reverence. "That crude tattoo you mocked? It was carved into his flesh in 1968, under fire, in mud and blood, as a promise to his brothers. They called themselves the Ghost Divers. They went into hell with no backup, no recognition, no expectation of return. And unlike most units of their kind, Drake brought every single one of his men home. Everyone. Gasps. Murmurs. Heads turned toward Samuel, who stood still, face weathered but calm, as if the storm had nothing to do with him. Pierce's voice cracked, thick with emotion now. "You recite ethos. You barely understand honor, respect, brotherhood. This man forged those words with his actions. He didn't just follow the code, he wrote it. And you mocked him." The recruits wilted under the weight of the truth. Keller's chest, once puffed with arrogance, caved inward. Moreno's hands shook at his sides. Davis's eyes darted desperately, looking for escape that didn't exist. Pierce turned back to Samuel. His salute might have ended, but his respect had not. "On behalf of this base, on behalf of every man and woman who wears the trident, I offer you my deepest apology." The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed on every chest, forced every gaze downward. Only Samuel remained upright, calm, steady. He let out a quiet sigh, as though weary of the weight of old ghosts being dragged into the sunlight. His voice, soft and gravelly, cut through the air. "It was a long time ago, Colonel. A different world." But his eyes, pale, steady, unyielding, told a different story. A story of memory, sacrifice, and the unbreakable thread of brotherhood that even time could not sever. And for the first time, Keller understood. The man he'd shoved was not just a gardener. He was the foundation on which the very uniform Keller longed to wear had been built. The shame was unbearable. Colonel Pierce pivoted slowly toward the recruits, his eyes narrowing to cold slits. The silence was so taut it seemed to hum. Every man and woman on that parade ground knew the moment had come, the judgment, the reckoning. "You three," Pierce said, his voice like cracking ice, "candidates for the most elite brotherhood this nation has, and yet you have shown none of its values." Keller's throat worked, but no sound came. Moreno's jaw trembled. Davis stared at the ground as if wishing it would swallow him whole. Pierce advanced a step, his polished shoes striking sharp against the concrete. "The first principle is honor. The second is respect. You have shown neither. Instead, you mistook quiet dignity for weakness. You mistook age for irrelevance. You disgraced yourselves. You disgraced this uniform you hoped to wear. And worst of all," his hand swept toward Samuel, who stood quietly amid the wreckage of his spilled belongings. "You disgraced a man to whom every one of us owes a debt we cannot repay." The words landed like blows. The recruits flinched visibly, their arrogance crushed beneath the weight of a truth they could no longer deny. Pierce let the silence stretch, let it sear into their bones. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper that carried farther than any shout. "As of this moment, your candidacies are suspended. Report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. You will answer for this. Until then, get off my grinder. Now." Keller's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He saluted shakily, his face pale as paper. Moreno muttered, "Yes, sir," barely audible. Davis stumbled as he turned, his boots scuffing in the dirt. They fled, their exit a shameful shuffle past rows of staring eyes. The silence that followed was merciless, an unspoken sentence handed down by every soul present. Pierce's shoulders rose and fell with the effort of restraint. He turned back toward Samuel, but before he could speak again, the old man lifted one weathered hand, palm outward, a gesture both gentle and commanding. "They're just boys," Samuel rasped. His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Full of fire and vinegar. We were the same once." Pierce blinked, caught off guard. The fury etched into his face cracked, replaced by something else: confusion, then respect, then reluctant understanding. Samuel's pale eyes swept across the crowd, settling on the younger sailors who still lingered, wide-eyed and chastened. "Pride is a heavy anchor," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "It can hold you steady in a storm, or drag you straight to the bottom. The trick is knowing which it's doing." The silence that followed was no longer heavy with shame. It was reverent. The crowd absorbed his words like scripture, their gazes fixed not on Colonel Pierce, but on the man they had mocked only minutes before. Samuel bent, picked up the fallen photograph, and brushed the dust from its surface with a tenderness that silenced even the wind. The faces in the picture, Marcus, Eddie, and his younger self, looked back at him. Ghosts, yes. But ghosts who still lived in every word he spoke. Colonel Pierce drew in a long, steady breath. His voice softened. "Mr. Drake, Samuel, if you'll allow it, I'd like you to speak to my candidates. To all of them. They need to hear from the man who was the ethos before it was written." Samuel looked up, his lips twitching into the faintest ghost of a smile. "Careful, Colonel. If I start talking, they may find out we were only men. Men who made mistakes. Men who bled. Not gods." Pierce straightened, his jaw set. "They already think you are one, and after today, they'll never forget it." The words hung in the air, a promise that the incident would echo across the base, reshaping every recruit who heard it. And for the first time that day, Samuel allowed himself a small sigh, not of weariness, but of acceptance. The lesson had been delivered. The storm had broken. The grinder still hummed with silence, the kind that follows a storm leaving wreckage in its wake. The recruits had vanished, their shame trailing them like shadows, yet no one moved to disperse. Every sailor, every civilian, every officer remained rooted in place, waiting. Colonel Pierce drew in a breath, squared his shoulders, and raised his voice so all could hear. "Many of you don't know what you just witnessed. You saw a name you never read in your textbooks, a man whose deeds don't appear in our official records. But make no mistake, you all stand here today because of him." Murmurs rippled through the ranks. Eyes turned toward Samuel, who stood in his faded shirt and scuffed boots, looking more like a groundskeeper than the pillar of history he was. He bent to retrieve his scattered tools, quiet as ever, as though oblivious to the reverence pressing in from every direction. Pierce's gaze hardened. In the late 60 seconds, before the Trident was even conceived, there were men tasked with missions so impossible, so suicidal, that even their commanders prayed they would refuse. But they didn't refuse. They went. They were called the Ghost Divers men who slipped beneath rivers, infiltrated jungles, destroyed enemy positions, and vanished before dawn. They were shadows. Myths. Legends whispered only in barracks after lights out. Gasps ran through the crowd. A few veterans in the back closed their eyes, nodding slowly, as if confirming what they had always known but never dared speak aloud. Pierce's voice grew sharp, slicing through the stunned quiet. "Samuel Drake was one of them, and he is standing here on our soil, tending our flowers, mocked as if he were nothing." The shame of it burned into every chest. Samuel finally straightened, the photograph clutched in his hand. His face was composed, but his eyes, those pale, unblinking eyes, carried the weight of jungles, rivers, and comrades long gone. "I didn't come here to be recognized," he said softly, his gravelly tone forcing every ear to strain. "I came because I like the quiet, because I can still make things grow." He glanced at the marigolds, crushed but not dead. "Respect doesn't bloom if you trample it." His words struck deeper than any reprimand. They were not for Keller, Moreno, and Davis alone. They were for everyone: officers, sailors, civilians, veterans. Colonel Pierce snapped to another salute, sharper than the first. And this time, the officers behind him followed. Then the junior petty officers. Then the sailors. Until the entire grinder was a sea of rigid arms raised skyward, the air thick with respect that bordered on reverence. Samuel stood still, his weathered face turning faintly pink, as though embarrassed by the display. He shook his head gently. It was a long time ago, a different world. But no one lowered their salutes until Pierce did. When at last the colonel dropped his hand, his voice carried again, cold and resolute. From this day forward, no one on this base will forget what you saw. You will carry it into your training, your service, your lives. Because legends don't belong in storybooks. Sometimes they walk quietly among us, disguised as gardeners. The crowd exhaled as one, the weight of the moment pressing into their bones. They knew they had witnessed something that would ripple far beyond the grinder. And in the quiet that followed, Samuel bent down once more, planting a marigold stem back into its patch of dirt, as if nothing had changed at all. But everything had. The grinder slowly emptied, but the echo of that mass salute lingered in the air, like thunder long after a storm. Yet for 3 men, the day was far from over. Keller, Moreno, and Davis sat stiff-backed in a cramped waiting room outside Colonel Pierce's office. Their crisp uniforms were damp with sweat, their faces pale. Every tick of the clock hammered their nerves tighter. Inside, Pierce paced behind his desk, fists clenched. 3 of my candidates, mocking Samuel Drake, he muttered. If this goes public, if it even whispers out of this base, it will stain us for years. Command Master Chief Avery stood nearby, arms crossed. Sir, punishment's already clear. Strip them of candidacy. Ship them out. Let them scrape rust off buoys in Alaska. Pierce stopped pacing. His jaw set. That's too easy. He slammed his palm on the desk. They don't get to walk away from this mistake. They'll learn or they'll break. The door creaked open. Samuel Drake stepped inside, carrying his dented thermos like it was a shield. His presence silenced the room instantly. Even Pierce, who commanded men with a glance, lowered his eyes for a beat. They're just boys, Samuel rasped, setting the thermos on the desk with a quiet thunk. Full of pride, full of ignorance. We were the same once. Pierce shook his head, incredulous. Mr. Drake, with all respect, this wasn't simple arrogance. This was humiliation. They disrespected you. They disgraced the uniform. Samuel's pale eyes fixed on him. And you think breaking them fixes that? Avery stepped forward, voice sharp. They need to know what they almost lost. They need to know who they spat on. Ah, they already know, Samuel said quietly. His words landed with more force than a shout. I saw it in their eyes when the convoy rolled in. The lesson is burned into them now. The question isn't whether they pay, it's whether they learn. Pierce exhaled hard, the fury in him colliding with reluctant respect. What do you propose? Samuel turned his gaze toward the closed door where the recruits waited. Start them over. Day 1. Strip them of rank, strip them of pride, make them earn every inch again. Let them sweat, bleed, and crawl until the memory of today is seared deeper than their scars. Avery frowned. That's worse than shipping them out? Samuel's weathered mouth curved into the faintest smile. Exactly. Hours later, the recruits stood trembling in Pierce's office, their eyes fixed on the floor. Candidates, Pierce barked. Your arrogance has disgraced this base. If I had my way, you'd already be gone. But thanks to Mr. Drake, you've been given a chance. A brutal one. Effective immediately, you're rolled back. You will restart training from the beginning, with nothing carried over but your shame. If you fail again, you're finished. Am I clear? Yes, sir, they muttered, voices hoarse. Pierce's glare cut them down to size. Dismissed. They turned to leave, but Samuel's voice stopped them at the door. Keller. The young man froze, spine rigid. Slowly, he turned. Samuel held out his thermos. Water, he said simply. Keller hesitated, then stepped forward and accepted it with both hands, like a ceremonial offering. His throat tightened as he met Samuel's gaze. For the first time, the cocky smirk was gone, replaced by humility, even awe. I'm sorry, Keller whispered. Samuel nodded once. Lesson learned matters more than the mistake made. Now go. Keep your head down. Keep your heart right. The sea doesn't care how proud you are, it only cares if you can swim. The recruits left, their shame heavy but their path forward clear. And as the door shut behind them, Colonel Pierce looked at Samuel with something close to wonder. You forged them harder in one day than 6 months of training ever could. Samuel reached for his thermos, now empty, and tucked it under his arm. Steel isn't forged without fire. Weeks passed. The grinder that once echoed with arrogance now rang with grunts, gasps, and the rhythm of boots pounding in unison. Keller, Moreno, and Davis were back at the bottom, stripped of rank, stripped of pride. Every day began before dawn. Every drill was harder, harsher, designed to break men who thought they couldn't be broken. Keller felt every ounce of it, the salt crusting his lips, the sand grinding into his skin, the endless push-ups until his arms quivered like reeds in the wind. The jeers that once came so easily were gone, burned away by sweat and humiliation. One evening, his detail assigned him to groundskeeping duty. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knelt in the dirt, hands raw, pulling weeds from the edges of the barracks. His muscles ached. His spirit was raw. And then he saw him, Samuel Drake, kneeling in the same patch of marigolds, humming softly as he brushed soil over a fresh bloom. His faded shirt hung loose, his boots caked with earth. To anyone passing by, he looked like nothing more than an old man tending flowers. But Keller knew better now. His chest tightened, his breath caught. Slowly, he rose and walked toward Samuel, stopping a respectful distance away. He waited. He didn't speak until the old man looked up. "Mr. Drake," Keller said, his voice low, rough with exhaustion and sincerity. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For not seeing you. For disrespecting what you stood for." Samuel studied him for a long moment, his pale eyes steady. He saw no arrogance now, no bravado. Only a young man stripped bare, carrying the weight of shame but also the spark of something new, humility. Finally, Samuel reached into his cooler and pulled out a cold bottle of water. He held it out. "I know," he said simply. Keller took it with both hands, his throat too tight to form words. He nodded once. A silent promise passing between them. Samuel's voice, gravelly but firm, followed. "A mistake is a stone. You can trip on it or you can step on it. That choice makes the man." Keller swallowed hard, the water cool against his palm. He understood. As he walked back to his detail, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Heavy still, but this time, it anchored him, steadied him. Behind him, Samuel returned to his marigolds. He pressed a stem gently into the soil, patting the earth with tender precision. Around him, the base carried on drills, shouted. Boots thundered, the cycle of training unbroken. But every man who had stood on that grinder weeks earlier knew the ground itself had changed. The flowers Samuel tended were no longer just flowers. They were reminders, symbols of respect, warnings against arrogance, proof that legends don't always live in books or monuments sometimes. They kneel quietly in the dirt, unseen until the day you need them most. The sun dipped low, casting the base in gold. Samuel wiped the soil from his hands, his face calm, his eyes distant. He didn't seek applause. He didn't need it, because the lesson had been planted deeper than roots. And like the marigolds, it would bloom long after he was gone.